Neo Geo AES. When SNK launched that Neo Geo AES in 1990, it wasn't marketed as just another game console. It was pitched as the arcade experience at home, and that was literal. The AES ran on the exact same hardware as SNK's arcade cabinets, meaning you could play games like Fatal Fury or Samurai Showdown without losing a single pixel of quality. But that level of authenticity came with a brutal price tag. The console alone cost around $650 at launch, equivalent to over $1,400 today. And that wasn't even the scariest part. The cartridges, massive compared to other systems, often sold for $200 or more each. For comparison, the Super Nintendo released just a year later at $200 total, with games typically around $50. Parents looking at the AES had to ask themselves, why buy one Neo Geo cart when you could get 4 or 5 SNES games instead? The result was a system that became more myth than reality. Most people only experienced it at arcades, where the cheaper MVS cabinets thrived, while the AES gathered dust on wish lists. Even today, collectors call it one of the most expensive consoles ever, with some original games still selling for thousands. The Neo Geo AES wasn't just a console, it was a luxury item few could ever afford. 3DO. In 1993, the 3DO interactive multiplayer promised to be the next generation of gaming, but unlike other consoles, it wasn't built and sold by one company. Instead, the 3DO company licensed its hardware to manufacturers like Panasonic, Goldstar, and Sanyo, each releasing their own versions. The catch? The price tag. The Panasonic FZ1, the most well-known model, launched at an eye-watering $699. That was nearly triple the cost of the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, and even more expensive than most home computers at the time. The 3DO wasn't lacking in ambition. It supported CDs, boasted powerful graphics for the era, and had multimedia functions like photo and music playback. But the problem was simple. Nobody wanted to pay that much money for a console. While critics praised its capabilities, the average gamer was left staring at the price tag, wondering how this was supposed to compete. Even when the price was eventually slashed, the damage was already done. Despite having some standout games like Road Rash and Jax, the system couldn't overcome its reputation as an overpriced experiment. Within just a few years, it was buried by the arrival of the PlayStation and Sega Saturn. Today, the 3DO is remembered as a console with potential, but one that almost nobody could afford to take seriously. CDI. The Philips CDI, launched in 1991, wasn't even really supposed to be a game console. Philips marketed it as a full multimedia system for the living room, something that could play educational software, interactive movies, music CDs, and yes, video games. But the price was absolutely crushing. At launch, the CDI models were priced around $700, and in some cases over $1,000 depending on the package. That was the kind of money people were spending on home PCs, not something advertised with family-friendly edutainment. And then came the games, or more accurately, the lack of them. The CDI's library was a mess of half-baked experiments and low-quality titles, with its infamous being the bizarre Zelda spin-offs and Hotel Mario. While Nintendo had briefly partnered with Philips, the end result looked more like parodies than real games. Imagine paying more than twice the cost of a Super Nintendo just to play the strangest versions of Link and Mario ever made. By the mid-90s, when the PlayStation and Saturn hit shelves for hundreds less, the CDI looked like a relic. Philips had tried to create a futuristic all-in-one machine, but the insane cost and embarrassing game selection doomed it. The CDI remains a perfect example of how a high price can sink even the boldest ideas. LaserActive. When Pioneer released the LaserActive in 1993, it was supposed to be the next big thing. Built around the Laserdisc format, the idea was to deliver arcade-quality visuals, interactive movies, and expansion modules for both Sega Genesis and NEC TurboGrafx. Sounds futuristic, right? The problem was the price. The base unit alone cost $970 at launch, and that didn't even include the games or the add-on modules. Each PAC module, whether for Sega or NEC, was another $600 on top of that. Owning the full setup could easily cost over $2,000, at a time when you could buy both a Super Nintendo and a Genesis, plus a stack of games, for less than half of that. And what did players get for their investment? A handful of FMV titles, a scattering of Sega and NEC compatibility, and little else. The LaserActive looked incredible on paper, but was far too impractical in real life. By the time you factored in the cost, the limited library, and the bulky Laserdisc technology, it was already obsolete. Collectors today treat it like a rare artifact, but for most gamers in the 90s, the LaserActive was something you'd only see in a magazine ad, way too expensive to ever imagine owning. PC Engine LT. By 1991, NEC's PC Engine had already made a name for itself in Japan, competing with the Famicom and Mega Drive. But then came the PC Engine LT, a strange and ambitious redesign. Imagine a clamshell laptop, but instead of a keyboard, it had a flip-up screen with built-in controls. It was essentially a portable version of the PC Engine, with no need for a TV hookup. On paper, it sounded revolutionary, but in practice, the price tag was the killer. The LT launched at about 99,800 yen in Japan, roughly $800 USD at the time. For comparison, you could buy an actual computer for less, or two competing consoles with plenty of games. The LT also didn't come with any real advantages over the base PC engine. It used the same HU card games, had the same specs, and didn't include the expensive CD add-on that gave the system its most impressive library. And while it was technically portable, its bulky design and reliance on wall power made it less of a handheld and more of a novelty. Because of that, the PC Engine LT never gained traction beyond hardcore collectors. It was more of a status symbol than a gaming necessity, and it faded into obscurity almost immediately. Today, it's remembered as one of the rarest and most expensive consoles ever made. If you made it this far, drop a like and comment what your favorite video game series of all time is. FM Towns Marty. In 1993, Fujitsu tried to bridge the gap between home computers and gaming consoles with the FM Towns Marty. Based on their FM Towns computer line, the Marty was actually the first 32-bit console ever released, beating the PlayStation and Sega Saturn to market. But while it was technologically ahead, its price and positioning guaranteed it would never break through. At launch, the FM Towns Marty cost around 98,000 yen, nearly $800 USD. For that much money, Japanese consumers could have just bought a full FM Towns computer, which offered not only games but also productivity software and broader multimedia support. The Marty's game library was another issue. While it could play many FM Towns computer titles, the majority weren't optimized for the console. This meant buyers weren't getting much more than a stripped-down version of a high-end PC. On top of that, software support was limited, leaving the system feeling niche from the very start. The high cost, small library, and awkward identity doomed the FM Towns Marty to obscurity almost immediately. It wasn't embraced by mainstream gamers, and even Fujitsu barely pushed it. Today, it's remembered more as a quirky footnote in gaming history than a legitimate competitor. Its biggest claim to fame being the first 32-bit console that almost nobody owned, TurboExpress. The TurboExpress, known in Japan as the PC Engine GT, was NEC's attempt to turn the TurboGrafx 16 into a handheld powerhouse. Released in 1990, it was basically a portable version of the full console, complete with the ability to play the exact same HU card games. Imagine slipping Bonk's Adventure or R-Type into your pocket and taking it anywhere. That was the dream, but the cost made it a nightmare. At launch, the TurboExpress sold for about $249 in the US, which doesn't sound terrible until you realize the Game Boy was only $89. For parents in 1990, the choice was obvious: buy 3 Game Boys and still spend less than one TurboExpress. And that was just the entry cost. The system required 6 AA batteries, which powered the screen for only about 3 hours. On top of that, the display was notoriously prone to pixel issues and deadlines, leading to expensive repairs. For all its promise, the TurboExpress became known as the handheld for the rich kid on the block, not something the average gamer could realistically afford. Collectors love it today, but back then, it was a luxury curiosity. The TurboExpress was ahead of its time, but the combination of price and impracticality made it one of gaming's most unaffordable handhelds. Pippin. In 1996, Apple teamed up with Bandai to release one of the strangest consoles ever, the Apple Bandai Pippin. The idea was to merge gaming with the internet age, creating a machine that could run CD-ROM games, multimedia software, and even browse the web. It was supposed to be a computer for the living room, but the execution, and especially the cost, made it a disaster. At launch, the Pippin sold for $599, and in some regions even more. By comparison, the PlayStation was $299, the Nintendo 64 was $199, and both had far stronger game libraries. The Pippin's software lineup was its biggest weakness. Instead of getting support from major game studios, most of its titles were educational, experimental, or business-oriented. Very few of them looked like traditional video games, and the few that did weren't compelling enough to justify the price. Combine that with sluggish performance and awkward marketing, and the Pippin never had a chance. In total, fewer than 50,000 units were ever sold worldwide, making it one of Apple's most infamous failures. While the company eventually reinvented itself with the iMac, iPod, and iPhone, the Pippin stands out as the era Apple would rather everyone forget, an overpriced, underpowered console that nobody really wanted. PlayStation 3. When Sony unveiled the PlayStation 3 in 2006, it was a statement. Sony boasted about its cutting-edge cell processor, advanced graphics, and Blu-ray drive. On paper, it was the future of gaming, but when they announced the price, jaws dropped. The 20GB model launched at $499 and the 60GB version hit a staggering $599. For perspective, the Xbox 360 had launched a year earlier at $299, and Nintendo's Wii was only $249. Suddenly, Sony's next-gen powerhouse looked like the console nobody could afford. The price was only part of the problem. Early adopters were also frustrated by a lackluster launch lineup, confusing hardware configurations, and the infamous giant enemy crab E3 presentation that became a meme. Gamers mocked Sony's "get a second job" comment, which felt like an admission that even Sony knew how unrealistic the price was for average players. Sales stumbled out of the gate, and Sony lost its market lead to Microsoft and Nintendo. Over time, though, price cuts, strong exclusives like Uncharted and The Last of Us, and the Blu-ray's success helped turn things around. Still, The PS3 will always be remembered for one of the most shocking price tags in console history, proof that even Sony wasn't immune to overreach. Hi-Saturn Navi. By 1995, Sega's Saturn was already struggling to keep pace with the PlayStation in Japan, but Hitachi, one of Sega's hardware partners, decided to create something truly bizarre, the Hi-Saturn Navi. This wasn't just a Saturn, it was a Saturn combined with an in-car navigation system. Designed for use in vehicles, the Hi-Saturn Navi featured GPS capabilities, a built-in screen, and the ability to play Saturn games on the go. It sounded futuristic, but the cost was astronomical. The unit launched at around 150,000 yen, well over $1,000 USD at the time. The Navi was targeted at a tiny niche, wealthy drivers in Japan who wanted cutting-edge navigation and entertainment in one bulky package. But the concept had flaws. Playing full Saturn discs in a moving car wasn't exactly practical, and the extra hardware made it far more expensive than a standard Saturn. On top of that, the console wasn't widely distributed and never saw a release outside Japan, making it even more obscure. As a result, almost nobody bought it. The Hi-Saturn Navi became less a gaming device and more a collector's oddity. Today, it's one of the rarest and most expensive Saturn variants ever produced, a perfect example of a console that was simply too costly and too niche for the market. Thanks for watching, subscribe for more.